I plan to continue teaching through section 6 of Matthew's Gospel. And as I have outlined section 6, it is roughly from the end of chapter 20 and through chapter 25. That is roughly what I mean by section 6. And I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, as that is the recurring and central theme in this section of Matthew, judgment proclaimed against Israel and its leaders. As of today, we're moving into a fresh portion of section 6. I decided to call this, I have this portion, this smaller portion of section 6. I've given this portion its own name, its own title, as I often do. I'm calling this The Leaders of the Kingdom Losing the Kingdom. So that's my title for this portion that we're facing here in front of us, the next several passages. The Leaders of the Kingdom Losing the Kingdom. And this portion is characterized mainly by a confrontation between Jesus and the leaders of the Jews, in which Jesus tells several parables. There's some other stuff first, but eventually Jesus gets into these three parables, all directed to the leaders of Israel at that time. And that's what I mean by the leaders of the kingdom losing the kingdom. Those are the leaders I have in mind, the leaders of Israel, and the way Jesus confronts them with these teachings. Now for today, we're going to concern ourselves with a passage that is the beginning of this portion, of course, but which I also believe will set the tone for this portion. So I'm going to read Matthew 21, verses 18 through 22. Now, before I start reading, just to indicate something for the younger people among us, this passage features a fig tree. This is a kind of tree you're not likely to see walking around here, just because they don't usually grow out in the woods where we live or anything like that. This is a kind of tree that grew over where Jesus lived when he was on the earth, and it puts forth fruit called figs. And you might occasionally have cause to eat things that have figs in them, but you've probably never seen this kind of tree. But it's a kind of tree that's supposed to have fruit growing on it, okay? Just a kind of fruit, that's all it is, a fig tree. So Matthew 21, verse 18 through 22 says this: Now in the morning, when Jesus was returning to the city, he became hungry. Seeing a lone fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it except leaves only. So he's looking for a piece of fruit. He just doesn't find any fruit on this fig tree. And he said to it, No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you. And at once the fig tree withered. Seeing this, the disciples were amazed and asked, How did the fig tree wither all at once? And Jesus answered and said to them, Truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, Be taken up and be cast into the sea, it will happen. And all things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. Now I've divided my comments onto this passage into two sermons. So we actually have two sermons for this one passage, this time and then the next time I teach. Now this first sermon will focus only on the miracle performed by Jesus, the actual withering of the fig tree when he curses it at that moment. And my second sermon will focus on the question of the disciples and the answer given by Jesus. That's when they ask him, how did the fig tree wither so quickly? He talks to them about faith and its power. That'll be next time. But for this time, we're focusing just on the miracle performed by Jesus in this passage. Today's message is called the impatience of God. And that's the key word for this particular sermon, impatience. So, children, maybe you have a good understanding of this word. Anybody want to tell me what impatience means? Anyone? Jonas?
If you're impatient to open your presents, so you can't wait.
You can't wait. You're okay, that's one way of describing impatience. This is when you maybe have been waiting for some time, or maybe you've been able to keep calm for some time, but you reach this point where you just can't stay calm any longer. This idea of patience and impatience very much has to do with waiting, but there's also this idea of calm. A person who is patient is able to stay calm about something, a person who loses their patience, who is impatient, this person is now going to get really emotional. Their feelings are going to get the better of them, and they're going to do something. Now, in this case, we're talking about God being impatient. So the impatience of God, I think, as is shown somewhat in the actions of Jesus here in this passage. So again, my sermon title is The Impatience of God, and the main point of this passage is that sinners risk suffering under the impatience of God, just as Israel did after the days of Jesus. So again, that sinners risk suffering under the impatience of God, and that is basically what happened to Israel, especially after the days of Jesus. And you'll see more what I mean by those things as I go forward with this sermon. I have 4 major divisions for my outline today, so I'll read those off to you now so you know what to expect. First division for this sermon, Jesus' impatience toward this fig tree is prophetically motivated. I'll explain to you what I mean by prophetically when I get there. But secondly, my second division for this sermon, Jesus' impatience toward the fig tree is a foretaste of the judgment coming upon unrighteous Israel. So the withering of this fig tree is meant to, in a sense, signal something that is coming further on down the road in history. And then thirdly, the withering of this fruitless fig tree symbolizes God's impatience toward and rejection of the wicked Jewish establishment. And that's a phrase that I had to sit down and I had to think about what phrase I wanted to use when I say Jewish establishment. I will talk exactly about what I mean by that. But the withering of this fig tree symbolizes God's impatience toward them and his rejection of them, the Jewish establishment. And then finally, Israel should have taken warning at the threat of God losing his patience. And of course, most of them did not take warning, but they should have. And that is what I mean to talk about today as we go through this passage, or the first part of this passage. Now, while I have used the word impatient to describe God, and I do not wish to back away from that word, I want to make certain that you know what I mean when I talk about the impatience of God and avoid any misunderstanding. Because on the one hand, you could easily object to what I have said by turning to any number of passages about the patience of God. The patience of God is a strong biblical teaching, something that God says about himself, something that God's people say about him. So the patience of God is very real. But at the same time, we could also turn to another set of passages to prove another point, and that is that God's patience has its limits. So we're not saying that God is never patient, we're just saying that the patience of God does eventually run out, and his patience becomes impatience. And all sinners will eventually discover that God's patience has a limit, after which God will deal with them in a very impatient manner. So I think Scott was mentioning in his review of his kids' lesson about the goodness of God, that God does not immediately destroy all sinners the moment they sin. God actually does wait for them to repent, but there comes a point where God stops waiting. As Jonas was talking about, he just can't wait any longer. Eventually, God will not wait to punish sin, and he will do so. The patience of God will turn to impatience. So when I speak of God's impatience towards sinners, I am speaking of that time when the epically long-suffering patience of God finally reaches its limit. And of course, no one has greater patience than God does, but whenever God's impatience comes to the forefront, that is also a rather epic-sized impatience. It is a great amount of impatience manifested in wrath against the wicked. Now, I believe the actions of Jesus in this story about the fig tree were meant as an indication that God had nearly had it up to here with Israel. I don't know if you're familiar with that expression or that gesture, I've had it up to here. Maybe some of you younger people have never had the displeasure of seeing your parents say that to you and make that gesture. I've had it up to here with you. Well, it just means the patience is about to run out and the impatience is about to take over. And that is what I think Jesus is doing. He's sort of acting out the impatience of God beginning to take over toward Israel. Now, this impatience of God toward Israel is not just about Israel, it's also a reminder for all of us about the general impatience of God toward sinners who have long abused his patience, and the responsibility of his people to be blameless in that regard. So on the one hand, we have this warning through Israel, kind of seeing the way Jesus deals with that nation. We can apply that to everyone in the world and take warning about the very real impatience of God. And then for those of us who are God's people, who are actually followers of Christ, this is a reminder to us not to fall into the same errors as the wicked do and abuse God's patience, but rather to be mindful of that and to actually not abuse God's patience by testing it. All of that coming in more detail in the rest of the sermon. So let's move forward with my first major division. I want to say that the impatience of Jesus toward this fig tree is prophetically motivated. So there is very much a method to the madness here. There is a reason for why Jesus does what he does. He is prophetically motivated. And we need to explain this because this passage is a relatively confusing one. This passage has caused a great many Christians and students of the Bible either confusion or discomfort. They read this and they're not really comfortable with the actions of Jesus because it just seems like something he would not do. That is, of course, the reason also for any confusion we experience, just the realization that the actions of Jesus in this passage are very unusual for him. To start with an observation which is rather tame, this miracle seems out of place among the miracles of Jesus. Just looking at the miracle being done, you almost wonder, why is this here? Most of the miracles of Jesus are healings. So this is Jesus entering in with supernatural power to relieve people of their afflictions. It's a very good thing, a very notable thing. Even among the non-healing miracles of Jesus, however, this miracle with the fig tree would still be odd. There are these miracles that we sometimes call nature miracles. You might say the fig tree withering is a nature miracle, but even then it's still kind of out of place because the other miracles are more like calming storms, walking on water, feeding crowds by multiplying food. You know, these big, wonderful things that we see Jesus do. But now we see this other miracle of Jesus, and it's making this fig tree wither, just causing it to dry up, be gone right then and there. This miracle seems out of place among the other miracles of Jesus. So that is one strange aspect of this passage. But an even more unusual aspect is this whole response is surprising coming from a man like Jesus, meaning a man who usually shows a remarkable degree of patience. Jesus is not known for outbursts of frustration against people, let alone plants or other inanimate objects. Jesus is not the kind of person to, kick his car when the car won't start or things like that. If he had a car, he wouldn't have had a car. But if he did have a car, he wouldn't be like sitting there beating on the steering wheel if it wouldn't start for him in the morning. Jesus just isn't that kind of person. As we see in the Gospels, he's just not that kind of person. Even in the recent actions of Jesus in the temple against the buyers and the sellers, that was a planned response, and it was meant to confront a high-handed sin. Jesus just didn't see that and lose his mind. He actually knew what was going to happen there. He thought about that, and he did this deliberately. He had a reason for it. He expressed that reason. So even when he's attacking the temple, as I said, even that isn't just this random bit of frustration that you see Jesus exercise. You wouldn't expect this kind of guy to come to this random fig tree with such a hostility that he just curses it, makes it wither, as though the tree had blasphemed. You don't see that kind of action out of Jesus in other stories. And think about this. We're dealing with food, right? He comes to this fig tree, hoping to get some food from it, doesn't find any. Has this been a problem for Jesus in the past? Think about the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. That is the last time we saw Jesus hungry. It actually says that after fasting for 40 days, Jesus was hungry, right there in the desert. But the thing is, he didn't have to be out there. He could have left that wilderness. He could have gone somewhere to where there was food and eaten food. Jesus decided to stay out there for 40 days, not eating anything, and only after that does it say, and then he was hungry. It's like, that is a remarkable amount of patience patience toward this idea of hunger even. I mean, there's that gnawing in your stomach that makes you want to eat food. I find it difficult to fast for even a day whenever I do fast. Jesus fasted for 40 days, and he was able to endure all that. Now he comes to this fig tree, doesn't find a piece of fruit on it, and it's just like, well, no, there shall never be any fruit from you ever again. It's very out of character for him to have this kind of problem. This should be no real problem based on his reaction to hunger in the wilderness. This fig tree should be a non-issue. So whether due to the oddity of the miracle or the impatience of Jesus himself on this occasion, this event is often viewed with a great amount of confusion. We don't really know what to make of it. It makes a lot of us uncomfortable to think of Jesus reacting this way, and that is the problem. We need to figure out what is going on in the mind of Jesus at this time when he confronts this fig tree over not having any fruit. Well, to answer that confusion, I would like you to consider this miracle of Jesus as a prophetically motivated action. This is something that I hope will shed light on the nature of Jesus' actions here, thinking of his curse on this fig tree as being a prophetically motivated action. Now, when I say prophetic, I mean like the prophets of the Old Testament. That's what I mean by prophetic. I don't necessarily mean telling the future, although there's an aspect of that here as well that we'll get into. I mean primarily it's something like the actions of the Old Testament prophets. Now, the Old Testament prophets did some very strange things during their ministry. I am so glad that I am not a prophet, because I don't want God telling me to do these really weird things that these prophets often did. I'm glad to be just a preacher and not a prophet. I mean, think about some of these things that the prophets did. Hosea famously married a prostitute, something that I would not necessarily want to do, using it as an object lesson for God's relationship with Israel, of course, but marrying a prostitute. Jeremiah walked around wearing a yoke, those big harnesses that they put on oxen or other big animals to make them work for us. He walked around wearing a big yoke around his neck for a long time. Again, to prove a point, prove one of his prophetic messages he was preaching, but he did that. Ezekiel has a lot of fun ones. Ezekiel, well, this first one's not fun. He did not mourn the death of his wife. His wife died. You get the impression he didn't go to the funeral. He didn't observe any of the customary mourning signs that often associated with that. Again, to prove a point, but that's a very unusual action, to not even mourn the death of your wife. Also, one of the more striking ones, the guy actually built a little model of the city of Jerusalem and was actually kind of doing things with it and laying down next to it for a year and stuff like that, to the point where if you saw this guy, you would wonder if he was crazy just doing this. I mean, playing with this little mud model of Jerusalem and just laying there next to it for a year and not just, what are you doing, Ezekiel? Why are you out here playing with this little model city of Jerusalem? Well, again, it was to prove a point, but it was very strange. Now, here's my personal favorite, one from the life of the prophet Isaiah. The guy actually walked around in public naked for some period of time. I can't remember the exact period of time, but this was again to prove a point, but this is something he did, something that I hope God never commands me to do. Again, I'm very glad not to be a prophet because you have weird things like this. And frankly, looking at the actions of Jesus toward this fig tree in light of the actions of these old prophets, now the whole thing with the fig tree doesn't sound so bizarre as some of these other things these prophets were doing. But I think you get the idea. It's the same kind of thing, this oddity, these strange actions. In spite of all the oddity of what those prophets were doing, all of those actions were meant to convey some kind of message from God. They were meant to be a kind of illustration, a picture of what God wanted Israel to know. And I think this is the answer to the confusion we have about Jesus' impatience toward this fig tree. It is meant to be the same kind of strange event, meant to serve as an illustration for a message from God that Jesus is trying to give. So the impatience of Jesus toward this fig tree is prophetically motivated. It's meant to be an action like the actions of the Old Testament prophets. And that means all we have to do at this point is figure out what is the message. what is the picture? I mean, this is the picture, of course, but what does the picture mean? What is behind the picture? So that is our next challenge as we consider this passage. And that takes me to the second division of my outline for today. To help us understand this message, we need to delve back into the law and the prophets of Israel. We need to go back to the Old Testament. And when we do go back there, we will see that Jesus' impatience toward the fig tree is a foretaste of the judgment coming upon unrighteous Israel. This is where we get the other aspect of something being prophetic, looking into the future. Well, here we're going to see that this fig tree withering is a foretaste of what's coming on Israel, this coming judgment upon Israel. Now, going back to the Old Testament is going to help us understand this. Israel had been taught that righteousness resulted in prosperity and that wickedness resulted in destruction. This is just part of the way that God dealt with Israel under the Old Covenant. Righteousness leads to prosperity, wickedness leads to destruction. Israel first learned all this through the very terms of the Old Covenant. Now, I want to read a passage about this to you. This is from Leviticus 26. I don't just want to read the passage, and I don't want you just to focus on this whole correlation between righteousness and prosperity and wickedness and destruction. There's an element to this that I think is very important. I'll emphasize the words when I get there. But Leviticus 26, verses 3 through 5. Listen to this principle being given and the specific examples being given. Leviticus 26:3, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you rains in their season, so that the land will yield its produce, and the trees of the field will bear their fruit. Indeed, your threshing will last for you until your grape gathering, and grape gathering will last until the sowing time. You will thus eat your food to the full and live securely in your land. Now, in that passage, we do see that part of God's covenant with Israel was prosperity in return for righteousness, right? And if they will obey God's law, God will bless them in all these physical ways, like with an abundance of food. But notice that Moses very specifically mentions a kind of prosperity. He mentions fruit trees, right? Trees that bear fruit, okay? Which I'll ask you to remember that, because this is an important theme here. This is something we're going to see throughout these passages, that these fruit trees especially are being said to be part of God's blessing on Israel for their obedience. Now let's go on here a little bit further in this same chapter, Leviticus 20, verses 14 through 20. This is a longer passage and it's more of the same. This sort of covers the other side of the equation, wickedness leading to judgment. Leviticus 26:14 says this, but if you do not obey me and do not carry out all these commandments, if instead you reject my statutes, and if your soul abhors my ordinances so as not to carry out all of my commandments, and so break my covenant, I, in turn, will do this to you. I will appoint over you a sudden terror, consumption and fever that will waste away the eyes and cause the soul to pine away. Also, you will sow your seed uselessly, for your enemies will eat it up. I will set my face against you so that you'll be struck down before your enemies, and those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee when no one is pursuing you. If you also after these things do not obey me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins. I will also break down your pride of power. I will make your sky like iron, and your earth like bronze. Your strength will be spent uselessly, for your land will not yield its produce, and the trees of the land will not yield their fruit. So again, the law of Moses doesn't only promise prosperity in return for righteousness, but also promises destruction as the result of wickedness. This is part of the sort of basic idea of the Old Covenant that we see here in these Old Covenant scriptures. But also notice that Moses again specifically mentions fruit trees as falling under this curse. If you're wicked, your trees will dry up and they won't bear any fruit. That's one of the things he specifies as one of these examples of destruction in return for wickedness. So from the very establishment of the Old Covenant, Israel knew that righteousness resulted in prosperity and wickedness resulted in destruction. And one of the examples of that prosperity or destruction, depending on whichever happens, one of the examples of that is actually fruit trees and whether they bear fruit or not. Now, to connect all of this more to our passage in Matthew, the fig tree in particular, thinking now specifically of this kind of tree, the fig tree. The fig tree was often used as a signal of the prosperity promised to Israel if they would be righteous. This particular tree, the fig tree, is sort of held forth among all the other fruit trees as this signal as to how the nation is actually doing with regard to their righteousness or wickedness, their prosperity or their destruction. So let's read a few passages to prove this. One of them is also from the law of Moses. Let's flip over to Deuteronomy chapter 8. And then after this, we'll move out of the law into the prophets. Deuteronomy 8, verses 6 through 8 says this. It says, "Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a land, a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing forth in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees," notice the fig trees there, "and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey." All right, so Deuteronomy 8, verses 6 through 8, we have here, along with these, in this description of the good land that God is giving his people, that he'll allow them to keep if they stay righteous. One of the things in there is specifically the fig tree being mentioned as one of these indications of the goodness of the land. So there's the law. Now let's move on to the prophets. Let's go to Micah, if you want to go there. These are all passages we're just reading briefly. You don't have to stay there if you don't want to. But Micah is the next one where I'm going. Micah 4, verses 4 through 5. Again, this is an example of the fig tree as a signal of how the nation is doing before the Lord. So there's here from Micah, it says, "Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Though all the peoples walk, each in the name of his God, as for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever." So there you see this idea of Israel being committed to the Lord. As part of that, there's this prosperity. Part of that prosperity is you all get your own fig tree. It's going to bear fruit for you. You can just reach up, grab a piece of fruit, eat it off. You're doing great. You have this never-failing source of food in these fig trees. So that's one example from the prophets. Set alongside faithfulness to God is this fig tree as a signal of the abundance that God promises them for their righteousness. Now here's another example from a much later prophet, later on than Micah. This is from Haggai, or Haggai, however you pronounce his name. This is a short book, so you might miss it. It's between Zephaniah and then Zechariah, so you might miss it there between the Z's. But Haggai. Now, at the time of Haggai, the nation was supposed to be rebuilding the temple. Now, this is after they returned from the exile out of Babylon. They're supposed to be building their temple again. Now, the nation delayed for a while in rebuilding their temple until they finally repented. And the prophets Haggai and Zechariah had a lot to do with that. And they finally start rebuilding the temple. They finally get it done. Now, this is what Haggai says after that. Haggai chapter 2, verses 17 through 19 says this, "I smote you and every work of your hands with blasting wind and mildew and hail, yet you did not come back to me, declares the Lord. Do consider from this day onward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, from the day when the temple of the Lord was founded, consider, is the seed still in the barn? Even including the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive tree, it has not borne fruit. Yet from this day on, I will bless you." All right, so here's Israel. Before they repented, the fig tree, among other things, but the fig tree was fruitless, and all this other stuff was failing, but the fig tree is one of those things put forth there as an example of this. Everything was failing. But now that the temple of the Lord has been founded, God promises to bless them. So there you have the same idea of righteousness resulting in prosperity, wickedness resulting in destruction. And here in particular, one of the signals of that is the fig tree. Whether the fig tree is doing well or not, that indicates what side of the line they are on in the eyes of God. Now, I could cite other passages, and I will cite one more later, but for now you can see that the fig tree was often used as a signal of the prosperity promised to Israel if they would be righteous. It was also used the opposite way as a signal of the destruction coming upon Israel for their wickedness. So the fig tree is this kind of signal there, this sort of thing that stands for everything else as we read these passages about God's dealings with Israel. Now that I've covered all of that, we can return to our passage in Matthew 21 and figure out how all of this connects. The withering of the fig tree under the curse of Jesus represented the first stroke of destruction against the wicked nation. So this is basically Jesus using the fig tree, according to the way you see it used in the Old Testament, as a kind of signal of what God is doing toward Israel, how God feels toward Israel at this time. Now, Israel had been taught that righteousness resulted in prosperity and that wickedness resulted in destruction to their land. This was an aspect of the Old Covenant. This is the refrain of the Old Testament prophets as well. Israel had also been taught to view fig trees as one of the signals of whether they were prospering or perishing. Whenever the prophets are talking about this stuff, they say, look at the fig tree. Look at what the fig tree is doing. This is what's going to happen to the fig tree. And that's what they talk about when they talk about this kind of subject. And now, Jesus curses this fig tree so that it withers by an act of God and withers so badly, it's never going to bear any fruit ever again. It is a doubly dead fig tree at this point. That is what Jesus does. Now, I keep using this word signal. The idea of the fig tree as a signal of what God is going to do to Israel. Let's think about other kinds of signal, like when you're driving your car. Let's say you're driving your car and that light on the dashboard clicks on saying service engine soon or something like that. Some sort of warning light telling you something about your vehicle. That lets you know that you need to act before your car suffers a worse problem. You need to do something about this signal that your car is giving you, telling you that something's wrong. This is a signal of problems that are come later down the road unless you do something. Well, in the same way, this withering of the fig tree at the word of Jesus was a signal of imminent judgment on a wicked nation. This is a kind of warning sign, a signal, just like the lights on the dashboard of your car, telling the nation that something is very wrong here and things are going to get very much worse unless you do something. So the withering of this fig tree could have been viewed as a warning shot to the nation of Israel, at least to those Jews who heard about this or those who read about it in Matthew. Certainly the disciples saw this, perhaps word spread to others, certainly through Matthew's gospel to the Jewish people later on. They learned about this kind of thing. This is meant to serve as a warning shot, a signal of problems coming down the road unless action is taken. Now, at the beginning of this message, I said that the impatience of Jesus was prophetically motivated. The whole idea is to give this kind of prophetic warning through this fig tree. Similarly, the impatience of Jesus was also prophetic in its expression, focusing on a fig tree like the ancient prophets often did. This is something that they usually bring out in their writings, in their prophecies, to indicate to Israel what God is doing, what God will do. Jesus does the same thing. So he not only uses a prophetic method, he uses a prophetic image, the fig tree in particular. So this is a very, very prophetically flavored passage from the life of Jesus. So under this interpretation of the passage, the withering of the fig tree under the curse of Jesus represents the first stroke of destruction against a wicked nation. This is a sign of very bad things to come because of wickedness on the part of Israel. Now, I think this interpretation is strengthened by a connection between the words of Jeremiah and the actions of Jesus. I said I was going to read one more prophetic passage on this point, and that's this passage from Jeremiah I have in mind. And I think this one has a very strong connection to what Jesus does in this passage. Think about Matthew chapter 21. We've been here for a while. Matthew 21, we just saw Jesus judge the worshipers in the temple for their distracted and distracting way of worshiping God. They're in there buying and selling. They're distracting people from worshiping God. They're not paying attention to what they ought to be doing. This huge, horrible thing. Now, just after Matthew describes those events in the temple, Matthew describes this withering of the fig tree. So we go from Jesus' attack on the temple to Jesus' withering of the fig tree. We go from one to the other in Matthew's gospel. Now, that first passage about the events in the temple included a quotation from Jeremiah chapter 7. Jesus actually says, you've turned my father's house into a den of robbers. That comes from Jeremiah chapter 7. Now, in Jeremiah's book, after that accusation about the den of robbers, Jeremiah talks about fig trees. Jeremiah chapter 8. Let's go back there if you want to see it. I keep waiting for someone to get the courage to fill in my blanks that I put in there for you. It's a chance to show your astuteness and the fact that you're still listening to the sermon. Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 13. So after the whole scene with Jeremiah in the temple, the sermon he gives in Jeremiah 7, we come to another one of his oracles in chapter 8. Jeremiah 8, verse 13 says this, "I will surely snatch them away, declares the Lord. There will be no grapes on the vine, no figs on the tree, and the leaf will wither. And what I have given them will pass away." So Jeremiah makes his accusation against the people in the temple and then promises the fruitlessness of fig trees. He goes from the wickedness of the people to the resulting curse upon the land because of that wickedness, as you go from Jeremiah 7 to Jeremiah 8. Now, Jesus quotes what Jeremiah says about the people in the temple and then does this thing with the fig tree. So he's still kind of following Jeremiah at this point, isn't he? Now, based on this apparent use of Jeremiah, it seems that Jesus cursed this fig tree, just all the more it seems this way, as a foretaste of a judgment upon Israel, similar to what Jeremiah predicted as a judgment for his own generation there in the temple when he saw the wickedness in the temple in his own day. So all that to say, the impatience of Jesus toward the fig tree is a foretaste of coming judgment upon Israel. It is prophetically motivated and prophetically aimed as well, if you want to put it that way. Now that you have that explanation, let's get into my third division for this sermon, where we're going to do things a little bit different than what I've said already. I'd like to add another explanation to what I've just given. So we're going to kind of stack another idea upon all the ideas I've been giving you. This is different, but it's compatible with everything I've just said, and it's probably just as true as everything I've been saying. I think that the withering of the fruitless fig tree symbolizes God's impatience, his impatience toward and his rejection of the wicked Jewish establishment. This is where we come back to this phrase I was using, the Jewish establishment. I think there is a particular symbolism here, specifically against them in this action toward the fig tree. Now, what I'm saying here is a common way of reading the passage. I'd be surprised if none of you have ever heard anything like this, but I want to talk about it in detail anyway, just to make sure we all see it from the Bible. Now, to show this, guess what? I want to go back to the Old Testament and draw more upon some of these prophetic passages and show how they help us understand this point. Now, in the Old Testament, the fig tree is not only used as a kind of signal for how God is dealing with the nation, it is sometimes used as a symbol for Israel itself. Sometimes the very nation of Israel is symbolized as a fig tree, as God's fig tree. Now, I'm going to read two Old Testament passages here. These are the ones that most clearly refer to Israel as a fig tree, and both passages refer to judgment. So again, we're still staying on this theme of judgment against Israel, and in both of these passages we see the fig tree come into play yet again in a slightly different way. Let's go to Hosea's book, Hosea chapter 9. Oh, I marked these pages for a reason. Okay, there we go. Hosea 9. I'm going to read verses 10 through 11 and then skip to 16. Now, this first passage is Hosea 9. This passage is specifically a judgment against the north kingdom of Israel. And, of course, the largest tribe of the north kingdom is Ephraim. So very often, Ephraim stands for the entire north kingdom. I'm just explaining that to you because of the wording Hosea uses. So let's read Hosea chapter 9, verses 10 through 11, and then we'll skip a little later on. He says, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your forefathers as the earliest fruit on the fig tree in its first season. But they came to Baal Peor and devoted themselves to shame, and they became as detestable as that which they loved. As for Ephraim, their glory will fly away like a bird. No birth, no pregnancy, and no conception. Skip to verse 16. Ephraim is stricken, their root is dried up. They will bear no fruit. Even though they bear children, I will slay the precious ones of their womb. Very much a harsh judgment passage here against Israel, against Ephraim, the north kingdom. And in this passage, Israel under judgment is described as a fig tree. It's like, you were like a fig tree in its first season. Now I'm going to make you wither. I'm going to dry up your roots. You're not going to have any fruit anymore. So there is a prophetic passage using a fig tree as a symbol for Israel under judgment. Here's a second passage for you. The book of Joel. Joel's a little later on. This is Joel chapter 1, verses 6 through 7. It says, For a nation has invaded my land, mighty and without number. Its teeth are the teeth of a lion, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has made my vine a waste, and my fig tree splinters. It has stripped them bare and cast them away. Their branches have become white. So there you see once again this judgment upon Israel happening in the days of Joel, and Israel being symbolized by a fig tree, being stripped bare, being turned to splinters. So there you see another judgment passage using this figure of the fig tree to symbolize Israel. Both passages refer to judgment, and both passages use the fig tree as a symbol for Israel. All of this makes it quite possible that Jesus would use a fig tree as a symbol for Israel under the judgment of God. So when Jesus comes to that fig tree and curses it so that it withers, it's quite possible that fig tree is meant to symbolize Israel, and the withering of that fig tree is meant to symbolize judgment upon Israel. However, because nothing can ever be that simple, I do not think we can simply say Israel and leave it there. I don't think that's fair. Very often when people talk about this fig tree and say it's a symbol of Israel, they pretty much just leave it there, but I don't think we can leave it there. I want to make the argument that this warning must be against not Israel itself, but the Jewish establishment. You might say the leaders of Israel or the representatives of Israel. Now, when I say the Jewish establishment, that's what I mean. I mean the leaders of the nation, the Sanhedrin court, the priesthood, the temple, the rabbis, the synagogues, anything and everything which represented Israel as Israel. The institutions, the organizations, the offices, the customs, those kinds of things, those things that define Israel as Israel, all of that, that's what I mean by the Jewish establishment. I mean the Jewish status quo, if you want to put it that way. Now, I insist on calling this warning a warning against the Jewish establishment and not the whole nation because of what Jesus says in this very passage. Listen again to the curse that he issues for this fig tree. He says, "No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you. No longer shall there ever be any fruit from you." That's the curse he gives. Now, if that statement was made about the whole nation of Israel, it would mean that nothing pleasing to God would ever be found in that nation again. No more fruit ever. Gone. There's never going to be any faithful Jews ever again in the whole history of the world. And yet, we know that the first Christians were all Jews. You know, the people that we would call our spiritual forefathers, those are a bunch of Jews, right? And to this day, there are Jewish believers. I mean, God has maintained for himself a faithful remnant among the descendants of Israel. And Matthew knew this very well. Matthew was one of them. And he was writing his gospel, at least partially, to some of them. So very much we need to remember that as we talk about this. This is so easy to say, Israel, you know, God's done with the Jews. Well, what about the faithful Jews? God isn't done with them. We need to have a more narrow scope as we talk about this fig tree and what it symbolizes. We need to have more nuance, a little more finesse here. We can narrow the scope by looking at context, specifically what follows after this passage with the fig tree. Immediately after this passage, we will read about a long confrontation between Jesus and the representatives of the Jewish establishment. The chief priests are going to be there. Scribes and Pharisees are going to be there. The elders are going to be there. These men very much represent not just Israel, but the establishment of Israel, the status quo, all the things that make Israel distinctly Jewish. Jesus is about to have a very long argument, a very confrontational argument with those men coming up in the following passages. So context, I think, helps us narrow the scope of Jesus' warnings. You have this curse against the fig tree and it withers. I think it's a sign specifically of the things Jesus is about to say to those men about their role in Israel and how they're about to lose their role in Israel. I think it's a warning against the Jewish establishment, which of course by this time is wicked, very much against Jesus, already hoping to murder Jesus within the week ahead, in the time there where Jesus is in Jerusalem, getting ready to face his final week on the earth. All of that is happening. So, my suggestion for understanding this miracle in its fullest sense is that the withering of this fig tree symbolizes the rejection of the wicked Jewish establishment. Or to put it another way, the leaders of the kingdom will lose the kingdom, which is my summary statement for this whole portion of Matthew, following with all these parables that Christ is going to tell. The leaders of the kingdom will lose the kingdom. Their fig tree is going to wither. And Jesus shows that in this curse that he issues to this literal fig tree in this miracle he does. Okay, one more division for this sermon, and then we'll be finished for our sermon time. My last point is this: Israel should have taken warning at the threat of God losing his patience. This should have meant something to them. Matthew uses this miracle with the fig tree to set the tone for what comes next in his gospel. We just finished a portion of Matthew concerning the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem and the open observation of his divine kingship. Everything with his entrance into Jerusalem on the donkey, the stuff he's doing in the temple, all of those events are the divine king being openly observed. Jesus putting him forth as the manifest divine king of Israel. However, today's passage about the fig tree describes the events of the next day. So we've kind of moved on here. We've seen the divine king revealed in his glory, made openly manifest. Now the sun has set, the sun has risen. We're kind of doing something new. It's a new day. Also, this miracle, when you think about it, it's not a very open display. I mean, it's just there among the disciples and anyone who might hear about it later on through Matthew's gospel. It's not as open a matter as what we just saw Jesus doing. All of this tells me that we really have turned a page in Matthew's gospel. We've turned from the first portion of section 6 to the second portion of section 6. Matthew is doing something else at this time. And again, as I've already implied, this passage is setting the tone for what's coming up in this forthcoming portion where Jesus has this argument with the leaders of Israel, with the Jewish establishment, where he confronts them through these parables. And all of these parables have one thing in common, and you've already guessed what it is. It is judgment, some kind of judgment falling upon the the Jewish leaders for their wickedness. Not necessarily even all the nation. In these parables coming up, Jesus will actually mention people who remain faithful to God because they are faithful to Him. But the leaders of the nation, those who represent the Jewish establishment, they're out. They're going to suffer the judgment of God, and God will have nothing more to do with them. They are condemned. And that condemnation is being foretold here in the withering of this fig tree. This fig tree is very much setting the tone for what's coming up in this portion of Matthew. You could also say, if you want to broaden your scope a little bit here, you could say that this fig tree and its withering is a good summary of the entirety of Matthew's 6th section. It is very much a good summary of everything we're studying from the end of chapter 20 of Matthew through chapter 25. Because in section 6, we're going to see Jesus pronounce judgment against Israel and its leaders. It's the common theme. And if I sound repetitive, it's because Matthew is repetitive. He really is hitting this point very hard in the last week of the ministry of Jesus Christ. And so what you have here in this withering of the fig tree, you can take these few verses here as a kind of snapshot of everything Jesus is saying. Jesus comes to Israel. By and large, the nation doesn't listen to him, and therefore judgment is coming. And you see Jesus come to this fig tree. He doesn't get what he wants from it. He curses it. It withers. It's never going to bear any fruit again. This fig tree is kind of a snapshot of everything Jesus has to say to Israel here in the last week of his ministry. So on the one hand, you might say Jesus did this thing with the fig tree in secret, but he's being very open in what he's saying about what he sees wrong in the nation from the time he goes into the temple up to his last sermon, up to his trial there before the Sanhedrin. He is very open in his judgmental tone, if you will, toward the nation. There's plenty of reason here to take warning. Israel has had plenty of chances to listen to what Jesus is saying, to listen to what this man of God is saying to them. Now, in the end, we know that a great deal, many of the people in Israel, and especially the Jewish establishment, did not listen to these things, but hopefully, in the mind of Jesus at this time, he wants to see repentance. And we know that there were some people in Israel who did repent, and that is what all of these warnings are supposed to do, including this thing with the fig tree. Now, I've talked about how even if not many people witnessed the event with the fig tree there at the moment, Matthew is still recording this for posterity, for his readers, for the broader nation, anyone who reads his gospel, anyone who hears his gospel read. So let's think about that for a while. Let's say you're one of the later readers of Matthew. You come to this passage, you have at least some reason to believe that Jesus could do this. You have no reason to doubt it at this time. You're reading this with at least some measure of faith. How does this land on you as a reader of Matthew later on? Well, some of that depends on when Matthew wrote his gospel. There's some debate about this. The big watermark here, and I haven't said this specifically in this message, but the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70, that would have been nearly 40 years after the time of Jesus, when the Romans came in, besieged the city, leveled the temple, and leveled quite a lot of other things too. All of that is the great act of judgment that followed the ministry of Christ. There's a huge debate over whether Matthew wrote before or after that time, and how you read this passage is going to be affected somewhat by whether you're reading it before Jerusalem was destroyed or after Jerusalem was destroyed. If Matthew wrote after the fall of Jerusalem, then each of his readers had a chance to confess and repent of their own measure of wickedness in bringing forth that judgment. This is a chance for them to reflect upon their life, especially if they're a very old person, and look back and say, when Jesus was walking around my streets, I didn't really pay that much attention to him, at least not after they crucified him. I just continued in my ways and didn't repent, and here come the Romans to destroy our city. And this is a chance for him to reflect upon those things, to confess his own contribution to that wickedness and the judgment that fell, and repent sort of after the fact. But better late than never, right? Now, if Matthew wrote before the fall of Jerusalem, the story would have been much the same effect, except that the reader has a chance to take warning ahead of time and maybe wonder, is this judgment still coming? Sure seems like most people aren't following Jesus in my country. Maybe this oracle of doom is still operating. This is a chance for him to be, if he has not repented already, to actually repent. And if he has repented, to remain steadfast in his repentance and not fall away or go back to Judaism or anything like that. So one way or another, being a later reader of Matthew, whether you're reading this before or after that judgment fell, it has some value for you in encouraging you to repent or encouraging you to hold fast to your repentance so that no worse thing comes upon you later because of a further hardening of your heart. So Matthew has very much a message to send to his people in his own day just by recording this in his gospel. He has this message warning them against the impatience of God toward wickedness, just as Jesus did when he first encountered that fig tree and prophetically cursed it so that it withered. And that covers the sum of what I wanted to say on this half of the passage. Remember, we're just dealing with the first half of it in this sermon. Let me give you a summary for today, maybe a final exhortation, and then we'll conclude our sermon. So again, today's message is called The Impatience of God, and the main point of this passage about the withering of the fig tree is that sinners risk suffering under the impatience of God, just as Israel did in the days of Jesus. So that was the main point here, focusing on God's impatience toward sinners, how it was about to be manifested toward Israel, and how the fig tree signals that and symbolizes that. And I had four main divisions. First of all, that the impatience of Jesus toward the fig tree was prophetically motivated. Secondly, the impatience of Jesus toward the fig tree is a foretaste of the judgment coming upon unrighteous Israel. Thirdly, the withering of the fig tree symbolizes God's impatience toward and rejection of the wicked Jewish establishment. And then finally, that Israel should have taken warning at the threat of God losing his patience, especially for later readers of Matthew. They had a chance to learn from this later on. So all of that is the lesson from the fig tree. Now, as one thing I wanted to say here toward the end is that this passage, though I've spoken very much about God's dealings with Israel and stuff happening back then, we should remember that this kind of thing is how God deals with all the nations and everyone in the whole world. This isn't just for Israel, this is very much for us. I want to read another passage here that I came across as I was studying for my sermon. This is from Ezekiel 17. You don't really have to turn there if you don't want to. It's really just one verse. This is just something that Ezekiel throws in as he's in his prophetic ministry. He says this, Ezekiel 17:24, referring to the nations of the world. He's been giving this oracle about nations. He says, all the trees of the field will know, so trees, all the trees of the field will know that I am the Lord. I bring down the high tree, I exalt the low tree. I dry up the green tree and make the dry tree flourish. I am the Lord, I have spoken, and I will perform it. So that is Ezekiel's figure of speech for God's dealings with all the nations. Using the imagery of trees, if you're a high tree and you get wicked, God will chop you down. If you're a low tree but you're faithful to God, God will raise you up. He makes trees wither, he makes trees flourish according to what the nation is doing. This is what Ezekiel says for all the nations of the world. So this is very much a general principle. The wicked are punished, the righteous are blessed. God has some way of dealing with nations along those lines. It's not just Israel. Now, in a world at enmity with God, few people are going to listen to that warning. We know this. The faithful are few and far in between. We, however, are the faithful. We are the people of God. We are the people that actually do care and should care. So if anyone should heed this warning and do what we can to be sure there is some remnant of righteousness in this nation and in our own nations, wherever we are, it should be us. We should remember that the city of Sodom would have been spared judgment if there were only 10 righteous people there. Remember that story from the life of Abraham? If God had found 10 righteous people in that city, he would have spared the city and not destroyed it. He would not have chopped down the tree of Sodom, so to speak. So this is an encouragement to us to remember that we are very much, as Jesus would say in another passage, the salt of the earth. We preserve things. We keep everything from going absolutely to pieces. That is very much our role in the world. We should keep being that. We should be light. We should be salt. We should be encouraging other people to repent and believe, to maintain a righteous remnant in the nations where we are, so that the trees don't get chopped down around us and the trees don't wither around us, as the Lord did with Israel in the days of Jesus. So all of this very much applies to Christians in all nations at all times, and not just to Israel. And that is all I have to say on the first half of this passage. When I teach next time, we'll cover the second half with the question of the disciples and how Jesus explains his miracle and the significance of faith and what it can do. Are there questions or comments on this sermon today? Yes. Okay.